Okay, hi everyone. My name is Matt Dean. I'm a graduate student at the University of California, Irvine. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about social groups and meaning in life. So I'm going to share my screen here and pretend as much as possible like we're in a conference room and not spending our lives on Zoom here. But so if we were doing that, what I would do is talk off a handout. And so that's what I'm going to try to do here in this video, and hopefully that's easy enough to follow along with. The handout, of course, has also been uploaded here in case you want to scroll at your own convenience. So here's what I'm going to argue. I claim that recent work on meaning in life that focuses on individuals can naturally be scaled up to social groups. So that's the first claim. And then further, I want to argue that for the merits of a joint commitment account of the meaning of a group's life. So I'm going to do this in three sections. The first section will be sort of just kind of broad strokes. What does it mean for an individual's life to be meaningful? What is this property? How is it used? And I'm just going to focus on some uncontroversial or less controversial properties of a meaningful life. Start there to get a sense of what it means for the individual life to be meaningful. Section 2 will then be on two things. I want to first outline what I take a social group to be, which of course I'm sure there will be some presentations over the next couple of weeks focused solely on social groups, what they are and how they're constituted. But I want to give just a short sense of what I have in mind when I'm talking about social groups. Then give an example of a social group living a meaningful group life. So start from examples of how that works, show some comparisons between individuals and groups. And the final section will be where I present a joint commitment account that tries to articulate or make sense of what's happening when we talk about a group's life being meaningful. So that's the structure. So let's get first into section 1, the meaning of a meaningful life. So I'm going to start here with a few kind of, well, I say are standard examples. So to start with the examples, and then I'll draw out a few lessons or properties of what these meaningful lives bear, what properties are contained within a life that's meaningful. So I have two categories here, moral and non-moral examples of meaningful activity. So for some non-moral ones, well, doing philosophy is one example. Another is creating something of value that lasts for a long time. Maybe that's a monument or a great novel or something that lasts through the decade and becomes part of the English canon or something like that. This is widely cited as an example of meaningful activity. And the third case is facing and learning from adversity. So the idea here is that something like climbing Mount Everest, due to the individual's grit, hard work, perseverance, being well prepared, well trained, and then climbing to the top of that mountain is something that we might categorize as a meaningful pursuit, a meaningful activity. Whereas if I went to bed and had my bed airlifted to the top of Mount Everest, and I didn't face any adversity or express any grit or perseverance or overcoming of adversity. That's an example of the same consequence. In both cases, I end up at the top of Mount Everest. In the first case, it's meaningful. In the second case, not at all, or certainly not as much. Okay, and then there's some moral examples. Being a good parent, visiting a sick friend in the hospital, volunteering for a good cause. These are examples of moral actions that are often also categorized as meaningful. And so I think those cases are a little bit trickier because then we're blending two different properties together, moral praiseworthiness and meaningfulness. And so they're a little trickier to spell out exactly what's happening and why. The non-moral cases will be the focus of what I'm working on here today. I think it's clearer to pick out what's happening and to provide an account of meaningfulness in those cases. Okay, so those are some examples. And I want to take a few lessons from these examples and give you A through E here, some fairly uncontroversial properties of a meaningful life or of meaningful action. So A, I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. I mean, entire papers, entire arguments and debates have occurred for each of these points, but I think it's sort of a hand-waving sense of what's happening here is all we need for today's presentation. So I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. A, meaning is a value that comes in degrees. So it's not just a on-off switch, your life's either meaningful or it's not, but instead it comes in degrees. Perhaps certain times in one's life was more meaningful than other times in one's life, or you might say that Einstein's life was more meaningful than my own life. Maybe that's, yeah, he's had more time to work on this. So the idea here is just that it's a scalar notion. There's, it's not just meaningful or not meaningful, but it comes in degrees. B here, meaning is valuable in itself. So it's not the case that meaning is merely instrumentally valuable, but instead it's inherently valuable, finally valuable. It's valuable for its own sake. That's the idea in B. In C, meaning is distinct from happiness. So I think we can imagine lives that are meaningful but unhappy. And that demonstrates C here. So we might imagine paradigmatically meaningful life, like someone, let's say Martin Luther King, led a meaningful life, but I think we can stipulate or imagine a case in which someone lives a life just like his, but was unhappy for much of the time, or even all of the time, when he assesses his life moment to moment, or even holistically. We can imagine that he might consider his life to be an unhappy one, but we would still judge his life to be meaningful. So this is the idea of showing that meaning and happiness are distinct. And I won't go into it much or at all, but I think we can also imagine the opposite case, where a happy life is not a meaningful life. Perhaps just we can imagine the experience machine, where everything is an illusion, but it's an illusion that makes you quite happy. I think that's an example of a meaningless life that is nonetheless happy. Okay, let's move to D. Although many actions that are morally praiseworthy or meaningful, meaning and morality are distinct. And so I talked a little bit about this in our non-moral and moral examples, but the idea here is that some meaningful actions are moral, some are morally neutral, and the jury's still out on whether immoral actions or evil actions can bear meaning. But we'll set that aside. The uncontroversial claim is that meaningful actions can be moral or morally neutral. And finally, E here, meaning plays a role in well-being. So the idea is that all else equal, a meaningful life is going better than a meaningless one. Okay, so those are meant to be uncontroversial. Probably there are many questions about each one of these things, and there are, but I think you can reject one or more of these and still get a sense for what I'm gesturing towards here when I'm talking about meaning in the case of the individual, and still have a sense of the phenomenon in question here. Okay, so section 2, social groups and meaning in life. Two things here. So what is a social group? And I think I'm just going to give quote Margaret Gilbert here and say that it's enough to give a rough and partial characterization of a social group. So we might say that, echoing Rousseau, that its members are unified in such a way that they constitute more than a mere aggregate of persons. So two things there: they're unified in some specific way, and it's not a mere aggregate, or it's not just a demographic picked out by a statistician or something like this. Those are the 2 points that I'm going to stress here. And so some paradigm social groups would be book clubs, sports teams, hiring committees, parent-teacher associations, and so on. And so the idea is that each of these groups are unified in some way, and that they're not just a mere aggregate of persons. They're not picked out randomly or in terms of demographics. And so I say here, demographics are not social groups. So the category women or category men or young people are not examples of what I have in mind for social groups, because they lack unification in the sense in question. And so, put a bit imprecisely, but maybe colorfully, I would say that statisticians do not create social groups, but social groups create themselves in this unifying process. Okay, so demographics, so a bit of evidence for why we might think this is that it seems at least the demographics cannot take actions in the same way that social groups can. And I would claim further that they cannot bear the property of meaning in the same way that social groups can. Okay, so if that's what I have in mind. That's what I'm going to stipulate for the purpose of this argument that a social group is. And now I want to give an example, just one example. I think there are many, but here's one example of a social group pursuing meaningful activity. So groups often act in ways that do not pursue happiness or morality. And instead, my claim is that they are pursuing meaning. And so groups often act on what Susan Wolf calls reasons of love. And one way to describe the motivation for acting on reasons of love is as a pursuit of meaning or the maintenance of meaning of that group's life. And so sort of some broad examples, we might think of historians taking on this project when they're deep in the archives, not necessarily pursuing happiness or morality. In some cases they are, but not in every case. That's the idea. And amateur astronomers do the same thing. Philosophers do the same thing. I'm sure, of course, when we're sitting down to write that bit of philosophy, in many cases, it's not a pleasurable experience necessarily. It's different than, riding a roller coaster or something, doing philosophy. It's not aimed at happiness necessarily in every case, or morality. Now, of course, so some philosophers, of course, work on projects with moral import, and maybe applied ethicists often see their work as being morally valuable. But in many cases, it's non-moral, and yet it's valuable. And I think it's valuable in virtue of meaning in many cases. So here's a more specific example. I say, consider the crowdsourced transcriptions of Jeremy Bentham's unpublished work. So probably many of you are aware of this project, but the idea is that Bentham has thousands and thousands of pages of handwritten unpublished work. And there are these groups, or there's a group with subgroups underneath that group that work on transcribing and making this work available. And so I think this is an example of a social group pursuing a meaningful project. Now, we might imagine a volunteer who works for several years in a row to meet that year's transcription goal. So the goal that the group has for that year's quantity of pages transcribed or something like this. Now, she might take a year off, this individual working on this group project, or even the second half of a year off, and still say, we met our goal this year. And so this is an example, I claim, of a group pursuing a meaningful project. And as we'll see later in the joint commitment account, how individual actions can interact with or be how the meaning of an individual's contributions are distinct from the meaning of the group's contribution. Okay, so finally, just checking my time here. We've got about 5 minutes to talk now about my proposal for a joint commitment account of the meaning of a group's life. And so this is drawing on Margaret Gilbert's extensive work on joint commitments, and she and others have done a lot of work to show that joint commitments can make sense of group belief, group emotions, and many other group action, group psychological states can be explained in terms of joint commitments. So my claim is that joint commitments can also make sense of the meaning of a group's life. So I guess put a bit more formally here, the joint commitment account, the meaning of a group's life goes like this. The life of a social group is meaningful if and only if the following two conditions are met. So one, its members are jointly committed to pursue as a body projects that are meaningful. And two, to some extent, similar past projects have been successful. So past projects in the same context, past meaningful projects. And okay, so this is I think this can use a little bit of refinement, and perhaps that's something we can talk a little bit about in the Q&A or the discussion forum or on my own. I think this can be refined a little bit, but the general sense is that the group has performed meaningful actions in the past, and so it is currently a bearer of this property meaning, and then it's jointly committed to pursue as a body, to continue pursuing as a body projects that are meaningful. So it is currently a bearer of meaning, and it continues to bear that meaning by continuing to pursue projects that are meaningful, and it does so by means of a joint commitment. That's the idea, put less formally. So an example I have of this happening, you might say that Americans are jointly committed to pursue as a body the maintenance of those conditions that allow group members to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so what I like about this example is that it draws the distinction between the group and the individuals. It shows that the group is committed to maintaining these conditions for the individuals. Now, of course, Americans can be jointly committed to this project and fail. It can be a disaster. So there's of course success conditions to completing these projects. But at least this is an example of a group attempting to pursue a meaningful project, whether or not that group is successful in actually undertaking it. Okay, so that's the main contribution, I think, is the joint commitment account. And so I think one strength of this account is that it does a good job of describing what's happening when a group pursues a meaningful project. So I think it does a fairly good job of describing the phenomenon in question. And we can test that with examples in a longer talk or something like that. But I just want to gesture towards two other strengths for this account. And then I'll leave it there and look forward to your comments and questions. So the first one is that we sometimes feel that we're participating in a meaningless society. So this is A here. We sometimes feel, or we participate in social projects that lack meaning. Adorno worries that we are living in an overly consumer, that consumer society is meaningless. Or sometimes we worry that American life perhaps is overly materialistic or something like this. And so that's one claim, is that sometimes we feel like we're participating in meaningless social projects, but at the same time, we also feel that some individuals within that same society are living meaningful lives. So no matter how materialistic American life is, and whatever relationship that has to do with meaninglessness, lack of meaning, anti-meaning, despite that, I think we can still obviously point to many meaningful lives being lived. Perhaps even most of the lives being lived in such a society are still meaningful. And the joint commitment account can explain this phenomenon because of the way that because it's not a summative account. We don't, take the meaningfulness of each American and use addition to add them up and come to a total, a meaningfulness count at the end of the day. That's not what we do on the joint commitment account. So that would be a summative account. That's not what we're doing. And because we're not doing that, we can explain, or the joint commitment account can explain this disconnect between an overall meaningless society that contains overall meaningful individual lives. So I think that's one strength of this account. And I'll just quickly, I think I'll leave strength B here since I'm over time. I'll leave that for further discussion if necessary, and or further discussion if you have comments or questions. I look forward to talking more about this.